It's November 14, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Shaparenko. Today we start the day with a conversation about Russian Federation luring foreign students to them. It's covered in the investigation of Realna Gazeta, the real newspaper. Now hundreds of thousands of foreign students are studying in the occupied country. Regardless of the global isolation, the number of foreign students in Russia continues growing. They also study in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine at cost and expense of Russian Federation. Joining us in the studio today is Oleksandr Bilokobylsky, Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Realna Gazeta, who was directly involved in investigation about the foreign students studying in Russia. Good morning, Mr. Oleksandr. Good morning. So how have you come up with this idea of this investigation? Getting any verified data from the temporarily occupied territories from the territory of Russian Federation is not easy. So what were the sources that you've been using? How long did your investigation take? Please tell us about more details. Well, let me start with why it's important to know about it for us. In a couple of words, it's important to know about it to counter Russian aggression. And here we talk about some complex things. So before repelling some attack, you have to understand what you're dealing with. Specifically now, when there is a global war against Russian Federation is going on. Its global nature, I call it global, is because we see that there is involvement of international community in support of Ukraine, and the scale of special operations of Russian Federation all across the world, starting from the Middle East and ending with Latin America. And to us, to Ukrainians, it seems that the most important things are happening in our land, and really this war, this hot war, touched every single family in Ukraine. And this is exactly why the unity in our society is important to us. The unity with the international community is important to us. The joint front to support Ukraine is important to us. And they also understand it in Russia, and they try to undermine all those unities. And one of the tools of such undermining of unity is the influence over the elites of different countries. And the workshops of such agents of influence are the Russian higher educational institutions. What we've been starting with, we've seen the problem and we've decided to investigate it, to study it. We were looking for Russian agents in Europe, first of all, but then as the investigation unfolded, we've found out that the efforts of Russian Federation are focused on global south. Those are the states of Africa, Latin America, from where the students leave for Russian higher educational institutions. I suggest you to watch a version of this investigation, a video version of this investigation. It takes about 7 minutes, so I want to focus your attention that we wanted to communicate this information to the people living in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine who use Russian language in their everyday life. This is why it was made in Russian language, and we've used English subtitles for the foreign audience. This is why. Please kindly watch this video.
Иностранных студентов. Набор в университеты растет. Почему же в условиях жестких экономических санкций, колоссальных военных расходов, инфляции и бюджетного кризиса Россия наращивает усилия по бесплатному обучению иностранцев, в том числе на оккупированных территориях Украины. Об этом в расследовании «Реальной газеты».
Традиционно Россия привлекала студентов из стран бывшего Советского Союза. Это были цифры за 2022 год. Но в последнее время страна активно набирает молодежь из все более влиятельных стран Ближнего Востока, Индии и Китая. В общей сложности африканский континент сейчас отправляет в российские вузы 35 тысяч студентов. Увеличение значительное. В 2016 году их было 282 тысячи, а в 2022 году количество студентов возросло до более чем 350 тысяч.
Сейчас РФ объявила о колоссальном увеличении бюджетных мест для иностранных студентов. При этом все больший упор будет делаться на страны третьего мира. Президент России Владимир Путин заявил на саммите «Россия-Африка» об увеличении набора африканских студентов в педагогические вузы. Почему педагогические? Потому что их выпускники будут работать с молодежью и формировать мировоззрение граждан своих государств.
We would like more and more students to come to Russia, to come and learn across a number of disciplines.
В России не скрывают, что рассматривают студентов как будущих агентов влияния. Эту цель четко сформулировали в монографии «Привлечение иностранных студентов в российские вузы». Вот что в ней утверждается. Иностранные студенты являются как источником финансовых ресурсов, так и своеобразными агентами влияния, которые, возвращаясь на родину, пополняют национальные элиты и сохраняют личную лояльность к странам, где они провели студенческие годы.
Так что обучение иностранных студентов – это вовсе не филантропия, а, как и во времена Холодной войны, оружие влияния на будущие элиты ключевых стран мира.
Кампании по привлечению молодежи в российские вузы проходят и в Восточной Европе, и в Африке, и на Ближнем Востоке.
Дуже важливо розповідати саме на міжнародних заходах, яким чином Росія побудувала свою пропаганду. На жаль, ми вимушені констатувати, що пропаганда російська діє, бо вони витрачають, я не знаю, там мільярди під час повномасштабної війни.
Что же происходит, когда студенты приезжают в Россию? Российские СМИ освещают, как иностранные студенты становятся частью русского мира. Так, в прошлом году челябинский телеканал показал, как перед Пасхой трое студентов из Бразилии, Кот-д'Ивуара и Анголы приняли православие. В репортаже говорилось о том, как крестили иностранцев по православному обряду. А летом их делегация отправилась в паломничество по святым местам России. И это не единичный случай. В Белгороде, в свою очередь, еще в мае 2022 года сообщили об участии иностранных студентов во всероссийской патриотической акции «Мы вместе». Студенты якобы собирали и раздавали гуманитарную помощь для беженцев из так называемых ЛНР, ДНР и из Украины. Здесь важно, что все это произошло под флагом государства-агрессора по инициативе путинского Общероссийского народного фронта. А у некоторых иностранных студентов на груди был символ Z. Это вызывает серьезные вопросы о том, что будут делать выпускники российских вузов, когда они вернутся в свои страны. В декабре 2022 года 23-летний студент Якуб Зиеба был избран местным депутатом в чешском городе Пльзень. Это событие примечательно тем, что господин Зиеба совмещает работу депутата с очной учебой в Волгограде. Он баллотировался от СПД, партии «Свобода и прямая демократия», и имеет связи с французским национальным фронтом Марин Ле Пен. Молодой студент восхвалял путинскую Россию в социальных сетях, выражал восхищение Сталиным, критиковал ЛГБТ и заявлял, что качество российских вещей выше европейских. Этот поток пропаганды и дезинформации не помешал ему быть избранным представителем первого городского округа. Вполне вероятно, что именно для этого Россия делает свои инвестиции по всему миру. Иностранные граждане, получившие российское образование, могут стать политиками и общественными деятелями, которые продвигают российское мировоззрение.
Чому ми бачимо підтримку країн Африки? Тому що вони взагалі вважають, що дуже колоніальна політика зупинила розвиток цих держав. І тому, коли ми кажемо про російську пропаганду, вони натискають на дуже чіткі точки, які спрацьовують в всіх країнах.
Сейчас Российская Федерация пытается привлечь новых студентов в вузы на оккупированных территориях Украины. Об этом уже есть официальные сообщения из Донецка, где готовится преподавание курса «Русский язык как иностранный». Но, пожалуй, самое тревожное развитие событий – это серые схемы. Иностранцы поступали в российские вузы, но со второго курса их переводили в оккупированные Луганскую или Донецкую области Украины, а на последнем курсе снова переводили в российские вузы. Это позволяет говорить о якобы международном признании учебных заведений на временно оккупированной территории. Привлечением будущих иностранных студентов в российские вузы занимаются зарубежные представительства Россотрудничества, также известные как «Русские дома». Но не только они. Большую роль играет также Всемирная ассоциация выпускников российских и советских университетов. К сожалению, для многих иностранных студентов образование в России не соответствует их ожиданиям. Обязательно подписывайтесь на наш канал. Здесь мы рассказываем о том, что происходит на самом деле. С вами был Андрей Дегтяренко, это «Реальная газета». Увидимся!
Thank you. Well, basically, we understand what are the motives of Russian Federation to lure foreign students to temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. But what are the motives of the students coming there? Is it a myth about the best education that was in Soviet Union and now it is in Russia, or are there any other factors? Well, when we talk about the budget spaces in the higher educational institutions of Russian Federation, it's first of all free education, no matter is it better or worse than the national education systems, it's still free. Then it's free education abroad. You know, when we talk about any education abroad, it's a big plus in biography of any graduate. Third, even when students come to study on a pay base and the budget space for the foreigners is about 8% of all of the foreign students in Russian Federation, it's still cheaper than studying in other countries. And finally, the traditions. African, Asian countries sent their students to study in Russia for generations, just like they did it earlier, sending them to Soviet Union. So it's a matter of consistency and inheritance. And the future students are influenced by this propaganda, for training propaganda, because the associations of students of Russian and Soviet universities, they continue gathering in their countries and they persuade the future students to enter the higher educational institutions in Russia. And an additional argument here talking about Africa is not to go to a former metropolis, but rather go to a country which is, so to say, fighting with the colonialism, as if, well, it was mentioned in the video that the students are being lured to pedagogical faculties. What are other popular faculties for foreign students? I surmise it could be foreign relations, some diplomatic faculties, well, journalism, of course. Well, basically what they call journalism is in Russia is not journalism at all, it's battle propaganda, but on top of this humanitarian block, there is also such thing as export of technologies. Of course, not the most up-to-date Russian technologies, but something developed back in Soviet era, such as nuclear power, and the students go to study how to work on nuclear power plants that Russia builds in a number of countries. How does Russia add their narratives, their propaganda in different curricula, in different spheres? Do we have any information about that? Well, the civil movements, quote unquote, the students, they unite into associations. There is association of foreign students in Russia. They have regular gatherings all around the country. Students from all over the country, like leaders, they gather there. They perform some work related to integration into Russian society, and then they get back to their communities with that. Does the majority of the students come back to their countries, or the majority still stays in Russia? Do we know about any percentage, any distribution? Or what is the goal of Ukraine, to have those students then graduate and spread around the world, or continue living in Russia to work as teachers or as professors or something? Well, there is no single answer for that. Some of the students, they remain in Russia because compared to some of the countries, life in Russia is better. On the other hand, the students leave for their homes, and what's necessary to mention here is about the advantage and benefits Russia is getting from the foreign students right now, not in 5, 10 or 15 years when they probably become parts of national elites. But right now, those students who study at this very moment in Russia, they already communicate with their friends, families, relatives, loved ones who stay in their countries, and they convey what they are being fed with in Russian universities and institutes. To add a little bit to the previous question, because it's relevant, whether the ideological work is going on during the curriculum. So when the so-called special military operation has started, the foreign students were gathered and they were explained that in reality it's fair, it's not a war, it's an operation on denazification of Ukraine, and all those messages are what their students translate, because their families, they are agitated over there back at home. What's going on there? Is it a war going on? And they say, no, it's not a war, it's a special military operation. So, and that's the reason why the students are being transferred from MGIMO, the Moscow International University, to Donetsk University, where it's really dangerous, where the Ukrainian armed forces attack, and it's like their patriotism that no, we're not leaving our universities behind. Or do they really feel circumvented that they entered a university in Moscow and they end up in Donetsk? Well, obviously there are cases like that, and after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, some students left Russia, they left for their homes, let alone the temporarily occupied territories, specifically Donetsk, because Donetsk is directly in the front line. In Luhansk it's more quiet over there, but still the tension can be felt there, and the presence of the military in the streets, well, obviously it adds to their anxiety. Well, can Ukraine somehow counter this activity of Russia in many parts of the world. I mean, activity related to persuading the students to come to study in Russian universities. Can we do something to counterbalance it? Well, Ukraine cannot counter this propaganda on its own. We can counter the recognition of diplomas that the students were obtaining in the temporarily occupied territories, for example, and there are cases of that. So the students who were studying for some time in temporarily occupied territories, and then they come back, or they come to Europe with those diplomas trying to get employed, they were not able to do that because they were told they were studying in illegal universities, so their diplomas were cancelled, and I'm aware of a number of such cases. But again, I want to repeat it. Ukraine cannot cope with this global network. We need the support of international community here. Well, before we all go to Google, let me ask you, what is the situation with this Czech deputy with Russian education? Is he still in his office? Because Czech Republic is a country that supports us objectively. This is why we have to draw their attention to this situation. Well, he's still a deputy. Well, I hope it's gonna change soon. I invite all the journalists to join our conversation. In case we have any questions, please proceed to asking them. If there are no questions, let me ask you, will you continue researching this situation? Maybe thanks to this investigation, you want to get the international community involved in this work. You say that the diplomas are being cancelled, but maybe we have to scale things up. Well, we work with international journalist investigative organizations, and we try to communicate this information to the international community. Whether we continue working on this topic, yes, we do. And not only in the sense of Russian students, but also we're trying to find poorly researched mechanisms of influence of Russian Federation over the global communities. And let me make an announcement here. We are about to come up with a new investigation about the so-called international observers, the so-called elections in Russia this September. Those quote-unquote observers were mostly in the temporarily occupied territories, so that you could just imagine the scale. There were the number of international observers all around Russia was around 50. To compare it with Ukraine, during the last presidential elections, there were around 2,400 international observers during the elections in Ukraine. So the country is thrice as smaller, but the number of observers is way bigger. So a number of those observers used to work with the so-called Association of Africa that was created in 2018 by the organizations close to the past Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the head of this organization is related to this investigation. So he is a graduate of a number of Russian universities. It's just the illustration of how they really work. They become pseudo-experts. They work all around the world, all around the African continent. Thank you, Mr. Oleksandr. Thank you for disclosing details about your investigation, and we're having questions on the floor. Spectre Editorial Latvia, do you have any details about students from Baltic countries studying in the territory of Russian Federation or so-called LDPR. Thank you for your question. We don't have names and we are only aware about the lists of the countries that from where the students come to Russian Federation for study. That such lists, they include students from Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Yes, they probably are there, but I cannot give you any direct evidence of that for the time being. Thank you. Oh, we have more questions, please.
Or interesting story.
Треба переклад. Just a second, please. We'll use навушничок.
Це зробити краще. Я не знайомий з цією методикою. Допоможете мені, будь ласка.
Can you please help me with this a little bit? Just put it in another ear.
Okay, it's just a short. I'm from Amsterdam, Holland. Thank you for your very interesting story. I didn't know about this. Is there a chance that Ukraine universities just start to do the same as the Russians do and provide free education for foreign students? Did you ask the Ukraine authority about this, or is it an option? That was my question.
Well, it's a super question. Thank you very much. In fact, Ukraine used to do it and we continue doing it even during the war. I mean, starting from 2014, it's more difficult to do that. But the foreign students, they study and they used to study and they continue studying in Ukrainian universities. Among the countries of former USSR, Ukraine was on, I think, second place after Russia by number of foreign students. And on top of that, temporarily occupied Luhansk was in the third place by number of foreign students in Ukraine. And that's probably why temporarily occupied Luhansk inherited this reputation from the universities that used to be active there during the times of Ukrainian control. And I would also like to add that this is exactly what I've been thinking about this very morning. For example, earlier, in pre-war times, I think that the foreign students were not perceiving our Luhansk as a separate country. I think that they were perceiving it more as a part of a former USSR. And the point is that the students there were studying in Russian language, and that's a significant factor why we were not perceived as a territory of an independent sovereign country. And in future, as the war ends, when we as Ukraine will continue receiving students, when we will be able to guarantee safety and security for them in our territory, Ukrainian universities will have to teach the students in Ukrainian language. Thank you very much, Mr. Oleksandr. Probably if we don't have any more questions on the floor, let me remind you, we were talking about the investigation of Realna Gazeta, the real newspaper, how Russia lures the foreign students to Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories. We will continue our operation at 12 o'clock. the Revolution of Dignity anniversary is coming, and we will talk about the way it will be celebrated. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying tuned.